Good morning, and thank you all for joining. This has been a fantastic morning so far. Really interesting. Sometimes I think I'm interviewing people. This morning, all I'm doing is learning, and it's a real privilege to be with the people we've had a chance to interview, and a real privilege to be with Jeff and the group that you've put together, Jeff, this morning. I'm going to turn it over to you, but I want to make a few introductory remarks just quickly, Jeff. First, thanks for all the work that you're doing. I think the vision that you've put out there is something that's concrete that people can really get a hold of. Obviously, I've highlighted what you're doing in a couple of Forbes articles just to, give people a sense that we're not talking about 5G. We're talking about something very specific that we need to do. And if we do 5G, we create a foundation on which our economy can be more productive and we can create more opportunities for people. We've got to figure out how to do something that brings the country together. 5G would be a tremendous way to do that, and your specific project, I think, really would be a really good example of how the U.S. can do big things again. So really exciting. With that, I'll turn it over to you, and thanks for putting this group of great people together, Jeff, and thanks for all the work you do.
Well, Norm, first of all, I appreciate you continuing to do these summits and these panels, because I think it's key of getting the message out and communicating to the wider audience on the critical nature of this digital infrastructure and just infrastructure in general within the United States. So the group that we assembled here is from my perspective pretty much the cornerstone of talent that is going to help drive this forward, because it's a multifaceted, as we've talked about many times before. It's not about just antennas being densified within the city to support this broadband communication. There's a whole bunch of other technologies that have to be deployed densely within the cities, and there's a lot of challenges in that, because we're now dealing with the easements that this technology is going to go on to is predominantly owned by city, states, and in some cases federal government. So that's why the group that we put together, I'll have everybody introduce themselves, but we have representation from the public-private partnership expertise, edge computing expertise, really about the complex policy work, whether it be easements or navigation or many other challenges, and then really a cornerstone to the pass industry. Ted Miller represents really a major boom in infrastructure that just took place from the late 80s to modern day, and has, I think, a tremendous amount of insight to share on how this new rollout is going to occur. So maybe I'll pass it off to you, Ted, to make introduction, just so people know you, and we'll go around the room.
Sure. Ted Miller here, founder and former chairman, CEO of Crown Counsel International, New York Stock Exchange company in the communication infrastructure business.
And John?
John Cowen, co-founder and CEO of EDJX. We build software that makes it possible for developers to access all of this infrastructure 4.0 technology, such as edge computing and 5G on a planet scale.
Great. And Knight?
My name is Knight Keys. I'm a real estate developer, focused on public-private partnerships. And so when it comes to this aspect of it, trying to roll out infrastructure and nationwide and bringing together a lot of these different technologies fall under this umbrella of 5G, when in actuality it's a confluence of a bunch of technologies that need to go in to upgrade our already lacking infrastructure in the country. So.
And Brent?
I'm Brent Skorup. I'm an attorney and senior research fellow at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University. And my background is in telecommunications and technology, and I've written extensively about the law and policy of easements and the right-to-way access.
And that might be a good thing to latch onto right there. Is really, how do you come across that concept, realizing that all this infrastructure? You wrote a great paper called Smart City Dumb Infrastructure, and you kind of identified very early on the critical nature of easements to support this, and that cities and states should not focus on the technology, they should focus on the enabling infrastructure that supports the various technology over time.
Yeah, thanks. Briefly on that paper, and I wrote this with Professor Kurokure, who's at Texas A&M's Business School. We identified a few issues that we saw coming down the pike. One, the federal government, state governments have been trying to do vehicle to infrastructure, vehicle to anything infrastructure for a while. DSRC is a famous example of that, and it seemed to us, and I think many in this area, they probably bit off more than they could chew. Innovation at the pace of government isn't that quick, and from our point of view, governments are better positioned to focus on the dumb infrastructure, is what we call it, this kind of semi-permanent or permanent real estate, including rights of way, including utility poles, including handholds on the rights of way, that they should focus on construction or a P3 that do construction and access to infrastructure, and less on the technology side. And so we made some recommendations, and also point out that there are large federal programs that do funding for this sort of thing. And hopefully with conversations like this, government and private companies can get together and start deploying this infrastructure.
Yeah. From our perspective, we have a multitude of industries. It's not just 5G, as Brent talked about, is intelligent transportation systems are needing to get densified equipment out at the curbside. Edge compute has to be densified across our cities to support all these advanced applications. And then even the assured position, navigation, and timing has to be densified to provide more security outside of just the satellite systems. And then the other use cases that are coming about are all compounded on how do we have a common and open infrastructure within cities along highways to support that. And when we put this together originally, we were solving it from the technical aspects, but now it's clear that we solved the magic ingredient, which everybody cares about, is how is it going to be funded? Where are the tens of billions of dollars going to come in? And we see it all coming in primarily from private industry to underwrite this. And that's where we can speed the adoption, and that's where, Knight, you might have some good ideas to share on that topic.
Certainly. And, I think that when we're talking about this type of infrastructure, and I think Brent pointed out very clearly that there's kind of a difference between the technical innovation side of it and what we call the dumb infrastructure, which is, similar to the roads and bridges. Those are semi-permanent, or hopefully fairly permanent as far as we're concerned, lasting lifetimes. But which side of the equation is better equipped to handle that, the private sector versus the public sector? And as Ted can attest to, there's really two types of infrastructure ways of deploying infrastructure that we've seen in this country, and it's been either started or seeded from the private side, and then taken and expanded through the public side, and then you see the large scale public projects that have been done, like the Interstate Highway System, and then more recently, as Ted can attest to, you see this digital type of infrastructure being deployed primarily using, private backing, private funding. And I think that, as Jeff said, where is the money coming from? How do we fund these types of deployments? And parts of it are going to come off of, as Brent said, the different use cases that come on. It's a combination of technologies that need to be brought to the forefront. And we can't rely on the telecommunications industry to just bring it all by themselves. It's a blend of new technologies, as we said, but proving those use cases out, because at the end of the day, it's going to be more than just building out cell towers, building out just transportation. It's going to be the confluences of all of these different systems together, relying on large-scale computing, very low latency, a combination of sensory types of devices. And so it's going to be, again, public-private partnerships is kind of the theme we keep harping on.
And Ted, you had an interesting way of describing this. You know, it seems that you created the generation of Tower 1.0, the industry that McKinsey wrote back in the 80s that there was going to be at max maybe 1,000 cell towers. So I think you saw the market much different than they did, and you built a enterprise off of that. How do you describe this next level of infrastructure that needs to be deployed at scale?
Yeah, so Jeff, I look at this fairly simplistically just because I have the benefit of some hindsight. There are actually more than 1,000. There's 4.5 million, not including China, right? And they're literally tens of thousands of towers and sites going up literally every day. What Knight was referring to with regard to the carriers and 5G, and then with regard to all the other technology that can be deployed on a pin. If you look back at history and the beginning of the tower business, the carriers were, before autonomy was even thought about and edge compute and so forth, it was just 2G, 3G, 4G, and the carriers were out building their own infrastructure, right? Each one, it was a land grab. Can I get to the corner of Main and Main where there's a lot of traffic and a lot of population? And so they would, each carrier wanted to build their own, and they go to the municipality to get a permit. And finally, the municipalities were saying, okay, I've got enough of this, time out. We don't want towers on every corner. It's a blight. And at the same time, the carriers' shareholders were saying, hold on, we've got hundreds of millions, even billions of dollars in hard infrastructure that returns nothing to shareholder value. So why don't we share this stuff? And that was really the beginning of the tower business. The carriers needed capital to deploy 3G. They needed to put money into new technology, which was 3G at the time, 4G, currently 4G in a lot of places in the world, and now going on to 5G. And we know that you can't really have true 5G unless you have edge compute and full capability utilizing the spectrum. It's not just the spectrum. So at the end, and right now, we're back to ground zero again. All the carriers are trying to build out their own 5G networks, deploy their own infrastructure, and the same, if you learn from history, that same thing's going to happen again. They can't, their balance sheets at the end of the day won't allow them to build out these 5G networks full tilt, right? But they're back into the mindset that I need to control my customer, I need to control the full 5G suite of services, It's not going to happen. Now, they may get a pretty good ways down the road like they did before, and then independent infrastructure providers are going to rule the day, in my opinion. What did a landowner or a rooftop owner get for allowing this infrastructure or the technology to go on the poles or the rooftops? Well, they got paid some rent. Similarly, municipalities, departments of transportation could utilize their easements to gain in-kind capability. So security, emergency deployment, communication within government agencies, and more importantly, the United States could have the security of knowing and securing this 5G infrastructure, autonomous infrastructure, et cetera, which we need, right? Because every day we hear about the Chinese and the Russians, and I've got some opinions about that I won't go into, but we do need to secure our communication networks. So the municipalities, parishes, counties, states, and the federal government all have an interest in seeing these easements utilized for that in-kind service, and allow this infrastructure to go in those easements. That's kind of a long-winded way of explaining to you that I think this is fairly simple. The handwriting's on the wall. At the end of the day, the infrastructure is going to the private sector. It'll be funded by the private sector. The question is, can municipalities and the government sector, the departments of transportation, get on the same page to allow their easements to be utilized with private capital to build out these networks? So that's that.
I mean, I think that's perfect. It really hits the theme that you know, with this the whole reason we're having this panel is we are behind the curve when it comes to like, you know, Korea and, you know, China. We have the innovation, we have the scientists, we have the engineers, and we have the ability, but it has to be something that's actually at a national scale. And if you look at how this common open infrastructure alleviates the heavy burden on any one provider. It's, you know, it alleviates the massive amount of spend that 5G vendors have to do, or the ITS vendors, or the edge compute, to accelerate the deployment. And more importantly, it can happen in all 50 states simultaneously. And I think in a lot of ways, it's going to grow a lot of the rural communities towards the city versus the city out. So I think the other thing it's going to help is accelerate the deployment of rural broadband. That has really been a misnomer. I mean, the concept of even what's the values of what's considered broadband have to be updated, because we have to solve it. And the numbers we have to start thinking about, even in rural communities, is 1 gigabit. But this is a good segue, because you kind of talked about the edge compute. So, you know, John, you know, I think I love the phrase that you use, is the data gravity, because really, as these gets deployed, data gravity happens.
Well, I think it's true. It's, you know, where there's infrastructure build out, it has a gravitational pull for data, and where data exists, applications exist. And that's actually the best segue that I can think of to describe what I think is the best way to articulate why we're even having these conversations. And it's really, to me, from my standpoint, it comes down to the fact that we're at the beginning of a new economy paradigm, right? So we often use the example of the build out of the national highway system as a parallel example of a nationwide infrastructure build out that employs people and, you know, and transforms things. But we often underestimate the real long-term impact of that whole process, and that impact is the creation of an entire economy. The entire transportation economy and all of the related supply chains that go with it were born out of that national roadway system build out. And we're at the front end of a similar size economy in what we often refer to as the Internet of Things. So I got into this business and tried to solve problems in this business because I recognize that the Internet of Things, the idea that machine-to-machine communication and data processing is going to be orders of magnitude, and I mean that with no understatement, orders of magnitude greater than anything that has ever come before it in the history of the Internet. And I have lived through, and my career spans 3 generations of the Internet now. This will be bigger than all of it combined. It'll be bigger than cloud computing. It'll be bigger than e-commerce. It'll be bigger than social media, all of it. And the reason why is because of the proliferation of devices and sensors that require high-speed communications and high-end compute processing capability. If you talk to companies like ARM, what they'll tell you, and if you remember, ARM makes the processors that are in most of the the lo-fi type systems that are sensors and devices out there on the far edge. What they'll tell you is that they're anticipating 1 trillion ARM processors to exist in the world by 2030. 1 trillion. That means there's 1 trillion devices, 1 trillion machines that are producing information that requires higher order processing in order to create intelligent systems. Intelligent systems don't happen because AI thinks of it. It's all dependent on massive amounts of information that require copious amounts of compute, storage, and network availability to process. And that's why, so I make these statements because it's important for us to understand that this isn't about infrastructure for the sake of infrastructure. This is about the formation of the next economy that is going to employ this entire country, whether you're the person who puts the shovel in the ground to build out a pin, or you're the developer who's building the autonomous vehicle application. It's a complete supply chain that's forming here, and we're at the very gestational stages. And that's why I think panels like this are crucial. It's important.
So going back to thanks again for Norm for number one, pioneering with the articles he writes and forming these panels. So to you, and what are your thoughts, Norm? Do you have questions or other thoughts about this?
Well, this is look, my only point is that this is fascinating. Every one of you guys made a fundamental sort of impact on how I think about this in your brief comments. And I think, when you talk about, the beginning of a new economy paradigm, and Ted, you're talking about the fact that the carriers are all trying to do something that they've proven in the past over and over again that they couldn't do, but they're still trying to do it. All the different players and the complexity here, plus trying to project yourself into the future to figure out what to do now so the future actually works out and it's optimized, is an incredible challenge. The next section, we're going to try to have action recommendations and get those over to the Biden people. But I wonder where this decision making happens, because Washington's not structured. I think one of you guys mentioned, maybe it was on another panel, but no, it was on this panel. But the speed at it was Brent. You said that the speed of government decision making isn't exactly technology speed, and Washington's not designed to do this, right? Washington's a mess. It's balkanized, right? You've got the FCC, Transport, DOE, somebody in the White House, maybe part-time. And, there's no overall way to think about this in a positive way and an incentivizing way. And that's what strikes me as I listen to you guys. How do we've got this whole impacted legacy system, and there's nobody saying, fine, it doesn't actually work anymore. You guys are going to have to do what John's talking about and recognize that what we're talking about going forward is light years ahead of how you're thinking. That's a big deal, and we're not even having a national conversation on that issue, right? So that's what strikes me as, sorry for being so long-winded, but that's what strikes me as I listen to you guys.
So I think that's an important observation about the state of Washington, because I think the state of Washington, quite frankly, is very different than the state of Washington when everybody got together and decided to get behind building a national highway system, as one example. So we have to realize that we're in a different era, we're in a different time and a different environment. However, what I will say is that, like all technological S-curves, as things move and evolve, this is an exercise in geometry. It's time and pressure. And what I believe that we're doing through the Autonomy Institute and Atrius and EDJX and all the things that we're building at a grassroots level is about demonstrating the veracity of everything that we're talking about. I don't want to have these conversations about theoretical planning and 5 years of committees. I'd rather just do it and show you.
Yeah, no, I agree.
Well, luckily, to your point, Norm, if you go back and look at some of the things that happened in the 50s and 60s, and you hear how Warner Senator Warner and Cornyn and Thune and Kane are speaking. I think there are some of those visionary leaders in Washington that basically have come together on both sides. Both parties are coming together and solving very complex issues. A perfect example of what Warner and Cornyn did with the CHIPS Act to secure more production and manufacturing of chips within the U.S. And now Warner's very passionately talking about, broadband to all. And I think even though it's not really just about broadband, it's the core theme that he's communicating is he understands the magnitude and the challenge. And so I do think that there's a will, and I think with a clear enough plan and enough unified cities and states championing it, it will be picked up for an all 50 state initiative, hopefully within the next year.
Now, I would add, there are kind of small experiments going on. LA, for instance, put on a contest for designers to design kind of a futuristic light pole that would be multifunction. And that's the thing. And I think that's why it's important to be talking about this. I don't know, sitting here, what the most valuable use of that rights of way is. It might be 5G. 5G is great. It could be DSRC. It could be GPS. It could be LiDAR. We don't know. And you want to make the infrastructure accessible to all of these technologies because they often need a lot of the same things, like conduit, like fiber connections, like electricity. So we know that part. We don't know the rest. I think the LA is a good example. Have these contests of designing these modular infrastructure systems. Japan, there's some cities in Japan doing similar, and that's something that can happen. But everyone on this panel knows that when we're talking about government action and government real estate, if you want it to happen in 10 years, you've got to have the conversations now, and really not too many have happened at this point.
Well, I was thinking it has to start in 10 days, but okay, 10 years, fine.
Yeah, 10 days ago.
But what's interesting to me as well is that, when I listen to Ted and I listen to John, the idea that a whole new economy is coming along, the idea that it's going to be funded by whole new companies, right? So what we're looking at right now doesn't look anything like what we'll be looking at. It's just like the biggest companies in the U.S. in 2010, they don't look anything like the biggest companies in the U.S. in 2020. And the biggest companies in 2030, it's going to be a completely different ecosystem. So, and it's really interesting to imagine what that's going to be because it matters.
Yep.
And then, so Norm, I'm sorry. I totally agree. I think John hit the nail on the head, right? You've just got to go out and do it. And you need someone that'll step up, right? So if we could get a city, a municipality, a Department of Transportation, so I'm just going to pick on Austin and TxDOT, and a carrier perhaps to be the lead tenant, that a carrier who doesn't have any infrastructure, a new entrant, so to speak, like a Dish, to showcase this new technology, then everybody's going to glom on, because once I bought Verizon's infrastructure back in the day, Bell South jumped on, all the AT&Ts jumped on, everybody started selling, right? Because they knew they had to have the capital to deploy into new technology. Once one of their competitors did that. So to me, that's the best way to do it. Washington will never get there. The reason Korea and China and so forth are ahead of us is because they can command it and demand it, and we can't do that. So it has to be by example, in my opinion. And once you have the example, everybody's going to glom on. Now, that doesn't mean we don't get the FCC, a champion at the FCC and a champion within the government, if we can get one, to do just that, champion the 5G, the technology of the future, because we can have a great military, but if we don't have what John just described in the form of a cohesive, all-in technology capability, we're going to lose.
Yeah.
Simple as that.
And this may be a comment for the next section, but I would say, piggybacking and echoing exactly what Ted said and what John said, and from an infrastructure perspective, and Brent pointed out that these kinds of installations, this kind of technology requires power. It requires conduits, and it requires access to these easements. Yeah. And as far as action items go, DOTs, government agencies, so forth and so on, just being able to plan how to provide those or make those accessible, even if they can't afford to install it. Understanding that that's what really their parts of it have to be when it comes to the real estate planning and the accessibility, and being able to cross over jurisdictions, going from end to end, and talking about, whether it's an interstate highway system, whether it's statewide. But as you cross jurisdictions, things start to change. Different utility providers start to change, and trying to get a little bit cohesive to form the road bed, if you will, of the power of the conduits that then allow, that could be the private industry, some of these challenges that can evolve quicker, that can figure out what this new technology is going to be that works best. But again, having that foundation of the dumb infrastructure nationwide, then it becomes an easier way to plug and go.
And just to keep things positive in the context of how far ahead China and Russia might be with some of these things, lest we forget that the German Autobahn system predated the Eisenhower system by 20 years, and we still beat them. So.
Yeah, that's a good point. That's a nice way to end this. I got to go. 30 minutes isn't nearly long enough with you guys. I really appreciate it. Thanks for taking the time, and hopefully, I can meet all you guys in person someday. Really appreciate it. Thanks so much.
My pleasure.
Take care, Norm.
Okay.
Thanks. Thank you, Norm.